Hello, learners. I welcome you to the second lecture of week 2. Today, we will discuss about right wing ecologism. You see, right wing ecologism is a kind of umbrella term which includes various ideological positions, starting from conservatism, then capitalist position, as well as the far right wing position, that is eco-fascism. So when it comes to their response to ecological concern or their solution to ecological issue, their suggestions are full of diversity. Like eco-conservatism will try to glorify the traditional way of life as a solution to ecological degradation. On the other hand, eco-capitalism will be talking about market-driven solution to ecological concern, and at the far right wing position, that is eco-fascism, it will try to suggest authoritarian, nationalist, exclusionary policies as a solution to ecological concern. So, in this lecture, basically, we will include three major right wing ideologies: eco conservatism, then eco capitalism, and eco fascism. So, this is the brief outline of today's lecture. We are going to cover following points in this lecture. So, as I mentioned at the beginning only, that right wing perspective covers a wide range of ideological position from early conservative resistance to Enlightenment ideals to extreme approaches like eco-fascism. So, as we have just discussed, that some emphasize on authoritarian environmental control tied to nationalist or exclusion policy, while there are others who advocate for market-driven solution like free market environmentalism and emphasize the idea of green capitalism, which somewhere prioritizes minimal state intervention and relies on private enterprise to address ecological concern. Now, if we see this political spectrum, so we find that on the one hand we have right wing ideologies, and on the other hand we have far right wing. So when we talk about right wing ideologies, it is basically what associated with neoclassical liberalism and conservatism. So it emphasizes on individual liberty. Second is limited government intervention. And third is free market principles. So, from this right wing ideology, two major strands of right wing ecology emerges: eco conservatism and eco capitalism. And in the far right wing, it basically does what? It campaigns for an authoritarian state that suppresses perceived threats to the nation. So this includes what? Nationalist, exclusionary, and often racist policies. So you see, it is very interesting that on the one hand, we have right-wing ideologies which talk about minimal state intervention. On the other hand, far right-wing ideology that talks about authoritarian solution to ecological question. So to begin with eco-conservatism, as the name suggests, you see, it seems that it must be some kind of combination between conservatism and environmentalism. So it somehow tries to find out conservative solution to ecological concern. So it is an ideology that blends traditional conservative principles with environmentalism. It often seeks to maintain or return to pre-industrial way of life. So it conceives industrial way of life as problematic. So it basically originates from two conservative principles. One is traditional conservatism, that is a romantic and nostalgic attachment to rural life and traditional values. On the other hand, there is a free market environmentalism that believes in market-driven solution to environmental challenges. Now we'll talk about the major tenets of eco-conservatism. Here you need to remember that mainly I'm talking about traditional eco-conservatism. So the first very strong belief of This traditional eco-conservatism is what? Kind of nostalgia for rural life. It somehow glorifies rural, pre-industrial way of life and says it was beneficial for nature. Second, it values conservation. When it talks about conservation, it aims at conserving the tradition, conserving the heritage, as well as conserving nature. So its concern is with conservation. Then it emphasizes on traditional values and institutions. The conservation of nature is tied to defending traditional values and institutions like family, community, religion, and also respect for authority. Now, when it comes to change, it believes in change, but what kind of change? Piecemeal change, incremental change. It doesn't go for radical change. It advocates for piecemeal and gradual changes to attain the goal of sustainability. Now we'll talk about the critique of eco-conservatism. Critics argue that eco-conservatism treats nature as an instrument for human use. So it is basically a kind of anthropocentric perspective which keeps human need and human use at the center and somehow undermine the intrinsic value of ecosystem. And therefore, the critics say that it perpetuates environmental exploitation. It wants to conserve nature. It wants to conserve the different species, but as a resource for humans. So that's why critics say it doesn't accept the intrinsic value of nature. Second very important critique is done by John Gray. Gray argues what? That eco-conservatism, though talks about conserving nature, protecting environment, but somehow it fails to address the deeper systemic issues that drive environmental degradation. So critique says what? That it talks about preserving traditional landscape or fighting for a particular environmental causes, but it doesn't raise that question that why do we need to talk about conservation? How have we reached this position? What are the fundamental reasons for this kind of situation where we have reached and we are talking about conserving the thing? So these deeper issue has not been taken into consideration by eco-conservatism according to John Gray. J. Young also continues with the same kind of argument where Young argues that conservative environmental concern remains for the most part parochial. It is not a broad framework. Why? Because they campaign in support of some favorite causes, some rare species, special bits of countryside, old building. So it doesn't take into consideration a comprehensive picture and a deeper systemic analysis of environmental degradation. These are the major charges of critiques against eco-conservatism. Now we will talk about eco-capitalism. This is one of the very, very interesting position. This eco-capitalism is also known as environmental capitalism, and also we call it green capitalism. So it takes a position that we need that kind of economic system which can combine environment and sustainability within the framework of capitalism. It says that yes, we need to protect environment, but everything has to be done within the framework of capitalism. We need not to go beyond capitalism. So basically its objective is to do what? To ensure economic growth. But at the same time, it has to ensure that economic growth occurs without compromising the health of our planet Earth. So it basically believes that increasing profit and environmental protection, they are not opposite to each other. They can coexist. There's a possibility of both together, that we increase profit, at the same time we can protect environment. Now, how to do it? How can we do it? That we have to increase profit also and we have to protect environment also. So what will be the tools for that? And here it believes in the role of market, some kind of market driven solution. like it talks about green technology, it talks about renewable energy. So, eco capitalism basically places emphasis on market driven solution. It argues that capitalism, when reformed again, then it can address climate change through innovation and responsible corporate practices. This is very important. It believes in the reformatory potential of capitalism. It says at the present time, we can say that capitalism, the mode of production followed by it, has resulted in environmental degradation. But it doesn't mean that capitalism cannot work in a different way. It says that capitalism can create a kind of, you see, different kind of green technology, different kind of products, and it can create a kind of market for what? For green technology. It can change the consumption pattern. This potential is only in market, and eco-capitalism basically wants to uh, use that potential of market. Now we'll talk about some of the major critiques of eco-capitalism. You see, it is very interesting to observe that this green capitalist thinking has had considerable influence on environmental policy making. But there are critics who have raised number of issues against eco-capitalist position. First, they argue that eco-capitalism prioritizes profit over genuine ecological balance. Basically, capitalism is a kind of profit-driven ideology, so it will always work for profit, and the concern for ecological balance would be secondary, according to critics. And Rachel Carson, in her Silent Spring, she made it very clear that the effort for sustainability must go beyond corporate interest. It is not possible to accommodate it within corporate interest if we really want to protect environment. Uh, Another critique is that capitalism basically believes in profit, and therefore it consider everything as commodity, and therefore it is basically based on the tendency of commodification of nature. It is depending on the commodification of environmental resources. So therefore the critics say ultimately it will lead to superficial environmental commitment. And critics have raised a very strong argument to practices like greenwashing. They argue what that the practice like greenwashing, where companies and organizations present themselves as environment friendly through making misleading claims or marketing, and do not make significant effort towards sustainability. So this is very important, you see, to understand one thing. Suppose there is a company and they are producing some kind of green technology or green goods. If those technology and green good can actually contribute to protection of environment and they are doing marketing for that, so that act would not be green washing, that would be green marketing. But if a company only to get profit is claiming its product to be eco-friendly, and actually that is not eco-friendly, so when it is engaged in this practice of making false claim, that is actually greenwashing. And critics say this kind of practice makes it very very clear that it cannot actually solve the question of environment or protection of the environment. Now, the strongest critique obviously of green capitalism comes from where? From Marxian perspective. They argue what? That the any kind of attempt to reduce the impact on environment, that will need radical economic and cultural changes. But this kind of change is not possible within the capitalist framework. And therefore, they say that green capitalism cannot solve the ecological concerns and question genuinely. Now, we will talk about one of the most controversial ideological position, that is eco-fascism. You see, 1960s and 70s, when environmentalism and environmental concern became the most important concern. That was the age of democracy, and obviously that led to emergence of number of movements, people's movement to protect environment. And it is very interesting that in this age of democracy, how a kind of background was created for this eco-fascist position. Basically, what happens that whenever a major crisis emerge, so authoritarian ideology try to do what? They try to explain that they have the solution to this problem. And this emergence of green issues or emergence of environmental concern gave them that opportunity, where they actually tried to exploit chaos to again assert control. In fact, this eco-fascism creates a very twisted and a very corrupted view of environmentalism, where they present authoritarianism, nationalism, and racial purity as the tools and solutions to ecological question. We'll see what are the core beliefs of eco-fascism. First, it emphasizes a lot on overpopulation. You see, whenever we make a kind of assessment of environmental degradation, so we know that overpopulation is one of the major reasons for that. But at the same time, the consumption pattern, misuse of the resources, social inequality, where rich have a lot of resources, that also contribute to ecological degradation. Now, the problem with eco-fascists is that they do what? They recognize the environmental crisis, but prefers focus on demographic argument rather than addressing the issue of mismanagement of resources and the extreme inequalities in resource consumption. So it goes with the argument that there are too many people on the planet and there's a need for stringent population control policy. And not only this, they also blame certain section of the population responsible for this overpopulation and who are somehow stigmatized, who are made responsible for all environmental crises. Third, it is based on some kind of blood and soil ideology. So it does what? It often connects a nation or racial group to its homeland, reflecting a blood and soil ideology that views the land and its resources as intrinsically tied to particular people. So it makes a kind of claim that this land belongs to these people and all the resources which is there in this land, that all belong to those people. So it should not be shared with so-called outsider. So this kind of framework leads to what kind of policy which can be called anti-globalization, anti-immigration. So this results from this blood and soil ideology. And one very important feature is also blaming the global south, that is developing nations, for ecological issues, advocating for extreme population control based on race. Here we will discuss about Garrett Hardin's lifeboat ethics, which is associated with overpopulation. So Hardin gave this thesis in 1974, and he lays out the premise of how each nation is similar to a lifeboat with specific carrying capacity. So it says every nation is just like a lifeboat. And if you allow more and more people to come inside, that will saturate the capacity of the boat. It has a limited capacity. So it will ultimately lead to constraining the availability of resources for the original occupants of the boat. So they say what? That every nation is just like a lifeboat. It has limited resources. These resources are for the people, the original people of that nation. If they are allowing outsider to enter into their nation, they will doing what? They are somehow trying to put their own future in danger. Why? Because the resources which was for them, now that will be shared by those outsiders. So, if we go by this analogy, so developed or privileged countries, they would not offer aid to poor countries or accept migrants from these countries. Why? Because they will raise the argument that it may stress the resource availability for their own citizens. It is very interesting that Hardin justifies his statement that the harsh characteristics of lifeboat ethics are heightened by reproduction. This part is very important, where he says wealthy nations are doubling in number every 87 years. Those outside are doubling every 35 years. So, who are responsible for this crisis? Those who are outside the wealthy nations, and they are contributing more to overpopulation, and therefore they are responsible. So, this kind of ideas in recent times has led to nativist, anti-migrant tendencies in developed countries. It has been seen that refugees from war-torn countries like Syria, Iraq, Libya, Yemen, they have been denied entry in many European countries. So, when we see all these actions from a moral perspective, then it appears that it is inhuman. But when you look at from the perspective of uh, lifeboat ethics, these acts seem to be completely justified. Now, the critics have raised number of objection to this position, and we will try to understand those positions or those charges made by the critique. The fact that migrants and poor are major contributors to environmental problems is often based on false assumption. What is that false assumption? Francisca Rocky, one very important name, where she questions this assumption on the ground that in reality migrants typically have a lower carbon footprint. That means their emission of greenhouse gas is less in comparison to people in the developed nation, because they often consume little resources and adopt more sustainable lifestyles out of necessity. So these migrants, these poor, they are not responsible for the present crisis. Further, this focus on migrants as environmental culprits and overpopulation as the only reason responsible for environmental crisis, it leads to a kind of distraction from the more significant issue. This is very, very important, that the environmental impact of industrialized nation, large corporation and colonialism, how they contribute to the present state of environmental degradation. This question remains unexamined when we say that all problem is only because of overpopulation. So the activities of this colonial power, corporate houses such as deforestation, fossil fuel extraction, and industrial waste production, critics say that they have a far greater impact than individual actions. So, if we focus only on population control and we keep on blaming migrant, so what is going to happen? We are somehow allowing these corporations, this big power, to escape from their accountability for their destructive practices. Now, there's a report by Oxfam International 2015. It is very, very interesting report which records that the wealthiest 10% of the world population emit half of carbon emissions, while the poorest half of the world population is responsible for just 10% carbon emissions. So here we can connect the argument which was raised by Francisca rocky, that who is contributing more to environmental degradation. So one very important critique is Michelle Chan, Vice President of Friends of the Earth. She states that eco-fascism is more an expression of white supremacy than an expression of environmentalism. So there are critics who say what actually ecofascism is what? It is a kind of green washing on white supremacy. Basically, they want to ensure supremacy of white race, supremacy of the rich, and they try to present all this under the framework of a kind of green initiative or green concern. Now, these are the references which I have used in my lecture. You can also go through those references, and this can be used as suggested reading. It will help you to have a deeper understanding of the topic. Now, coming to activity questions. Once again, I have designed it in the same way. There are a few questions which will help you to assess your learning, and there are a few questions which are created in a way so that you can think critically. So the first is that what are the core features of eco-conservatism that we discussed in the beginning of the lecture. Then critically examine lifeboat ethics from the perspective of global south. All the argument which is given in lifeboat ethics, try to understand that and try to examine that from the perspective of global south. And now you need to think over it critically. Can we see capitalist economy with a green touch, what we say eco-capitalism, as a solution to the present environmental crisis? I mean, can actually capitalism be a solution to the ecological concern? So you need to think over it. So thank you, learners. In this lecture, we try to cover various aspects of right-wing ecologism. We discussed about eco-conservatism, then we discussed about eco-capitalism and also eco-fascism and critique of all these positions. I hope it would help you to understand the right-wing ecologist position. Go through the lecture, and if you have any doubt, any query, feel free to post your queries in the discussion forum. Thank you. We will meet in the next lecture.